Hi, I'm Jason Proctor, and I'll be introducing Group Two's project on political correctness. In this project, we'll be looking at the Monk debate on political correctness. We'll be looking at the arguments made by the debaters, Michael Eric Dyson, with Michelle Goldberg on the side supporting political correctness, and Stephen Fry with Jordan Peterson on the opposing. We'll first break down their arguments into a standard form, looking at the conclusions that they make, and then looking at the premises that they make to get to this conclusion. We will evaluate the argument by looking at how it holds up against the rebuttals and other remarks of the other debaters, as well as seeing if it fulfills the question of the argument about political correctness, whether it should be supported or whether political correctness is uh, overbearing and should be reduced. Uh, in our presentation, we'll be covering the shortcomings of Peterson's argument about group identity, the successes of Peterson's argument about group identity, and the successes of Goldberg's argument about where the lines between free speech and political correctness lie.
For Jordan Peterson, much of, if not all of his premise for being anti-political correctness comes from his belief that individuals within society choose a socio-political group with which they most identify themselves, and then use their group to disavow and attack any side which opposes them. Jordan Peterson's idea of individuality versus group within society and its correlation to political correctness is only applicable to someone within his societal group. In his opening statements, Peterson explains that society needs to have a shared collective narrative in order to progress. So far, this shared collective identity has been focused on the sovereignty of the individual, which has made Western society freer than it has ever been. However, Peterson postulates that this shared collective identity has recently been changing into one that focuses on group mentality rather than individualism. Peterson believes that now every person within society makes it a goal to find the socio-political group with which they most closely identify with. It is then their job to defend the group and to actively attack any opposing group. This practice is political correctness, and it's causing constant fighting within society, stifling progress, and censoring those who oppose it. In breaking down this argument, I'll first take Peterson's idea that members of society choose their socio-political group willingly based on what they most closely identify with and believe in. In his opening argument, Michael Dyson explains that since the beginning of America, society has engaged on placing people into groups regardless of what their identity is. This has been done most notably through slavery, where every person of color in the country was in the socio-political group of slave and was unable to have any sort of individual identity. This type of group identity has persisted in the country, placing LGBT people, people of color, disabled people, certain religious groups, etc., into their own socio-political group without their consent or say. It is political correctness, then, that allows these individuals to have their own identity. Dyson notes that when walking down the street, most white people don't look at him and say, "Oh, there's an elaborate, educated black man." Instead, they have the idea in their head of what a person in the black group is and apply that to him. Political correctness would give Dyson the agency, in that example, to stop them and identify himself as he wants. A society that consistently does this breaks down group mentality and begins to see people as individuals. In his opening remarks, Peterson concedes that there is a reasonable left, but that members of the left don't hold themselves accountable and let people go too far. However, Peterson never elaborates exactly on what is too far and closes his opening statements by saying that he can't tell where the line is going too far. Political correctness is seen by Peterson as a censorship and something that is stifling free speech. Yet, Michelle Goldberg again brings up recent history to ask who's really been censored in Western society. Women and people of color were unable to own land or vote. LGBT people could not join the military. And currently, many parents are under investigation of child abuse for providing their children with gender-affirming care. In each of these cases, a lack of political correctness has led to individuals being forced into a socio-political category which denies their voice and individuality. In cases of the past, it was not until these groups were given the agency and ability to be seen as individuals that things began to change for the better. This was all able to happen because of political correctness. In the example of voting, once we were able to see a woman as an individual rather than a member of a group of women who don't have the mental capacity to make an important decision, we create a freer society. It is political correctness which has been making us freer, not the opposite as Peterson believes. The terminal collapse of Peterson's idea is that he happens to be in the socio-political tier, which has historically been the one to create groups which individuals are forced into, and does very little to concede to this in any meaningful way. Towards the end of the debate, he circles back to the idea that the left has gone too far, but does not elaborate. Dyson seems to almost imply that Peterson's entire argument is oxymoronic, as those who oppose political correctness are the loudest and most upset by its existence. In the end, Peterson fails to acknowledge that only people in his position are free to choose their socio-political group. Because of this, he fails to understand that most people within society do not have this luxury, and it is political correctness which allows them to make strides towards individuality and being able to identify themselves how they want to be seen in the world.
Hello, my name is Jeremiah Todd. I will be presenting in standard form Jordan Peterson's argument from minute marker 1550 to 2155. So premise one is Jordan summarizes the opposition's position as postmodernism mixed with a new neo-Marxism. The fundamental claim is that you are a member of a group, not of an individual, and that this is the way we should categorize people that are along others in that same group. Premise two is this is the proper way to view the world, is as between groups of different power levels. So you define the groups first, and then the assumptions from that will follow. Premise three, you view the individual from the group context, you view the battle between groups from the group context, and you view history itself as a consequence of nothing more than power maneuvers between said groups. Premise four, this eliminates any consideration of the individual, and at a very fundamental level, also any idea of free speech or anti-political correctness. Premise five, if you're a collectivist at heart, in this manner, there is no such thing as free speech. Premise six, in the formulation of this worldview, there is no such thing as free speech, and thus no such thing as political correctness. And then premise six, when you speak as a member of this group, you are playing a power game in representing your group. And then kind of a conclusion from this, if we follow these power struggles of this group identity down their logical path, we will not progress in society, but revert to the tribalism of the left. So that's the conclusion from all these premises. He kind of makes a separate argument about how hierarchies are how societies organize themselves. Left on their own, hierarchies tend to lean towards tyranny, but our Western society has done a good job of placing safeguards into the system to avoid this kind of tyranny. Our grand unifying narrative should be of the individual, which is also in line with being anti-political correctness culture, and to not group collective power struggles, and to not go down the venue of group collective power struggles. So my evaluation of the argument was, I think he did a good job, a thorough job in describing the logical end of PC culture, leading to kind of a tribal society warring within itself, in these kind of group collectives vying for power. The individual and free speech are no longer a concern for society. However, I do think that Jordan's thoughts seem to be a bit scattered, and they kind of just were not strung together real well linearly. He just likes to pontificate a lot, and that's fine. in a lecture, but in a debate like this, I think a clearer format would have done a better job of conveying his points more succinctly. So then I'll be covering counter arguments by Michelle, and this is in that same time stamped period. Jordan's argument is basically a false dichotomy between individual rights and group rights. So she's saying there's no clear demarcation line between the two. Traditionally, large groups of people have not been able to exercise their individual rights. She's talking about oppressed groups, and so she's saying that all of the civil rights movements throughout Western history are groups trying to self-realize, I believe she said, or self-actualize their individual rights. In addition to this, she also claimed that nobody is getting censored. Lastly, just kind of as a evaluation of the argument, I wanted to say that it just seemed that the presenters never did a good job of staying on the specific topic of political correctness. It seems like some people had pre-written notes and they were just sticking to those notes that were more addressing their opponent's arguments rather than the actual issue at hand. So it just felt real staged and real less intellectual, or not very intellectual, real less, not very intellectual. Then Jordan's counter to Michelle's counter is that, again, this kind of shows that it's not very on topic, but he says we know how to remove far right politics from the mainstream of right politics. We identify people whose beliefs, such as racial superiority over other races, and we remove them from right-wing politics because we can have a clear demarcation that this is outside of the norm. This is not considered normal, and we do a good job of getting rid of this extremism. But then he makes the argument, we do not, however, do the same kind of ostracizing of far left politics that we do of far right. An example he gives is things like equity. He believes it's nothing more than a Marxist redistribution of power that actually causes great injustice. And he talks a lot about how it's, not equal opportunity for everybody across the board, but instead equal outcomes mandated on society. And he argues this is like the far left thinking that should be removed from the mainstream, but that the left does not do this, and therefore their political correctness culture allows for essentially tyrannical movements to take over. That seemed to be what he was arguing. Again, I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt here, but it just didn't seem to be very focused or on topic. But anyways, that's my comments. Thanks. Bye.
Hello, my name is Amaya Hargrave Williams, and I will be presenting Michelle Goldberg's argument in standard format from the timestamp 9:35 to 15:35. So Michelle's first premise is that she thinks that people who are against political correctness use it to delegitimize women, racial, and sexual minorities' attempts to overcome discrimination. Her second premise is that all challenges to the current hierarchy that Jordan Peterson mentions are called political correctness. And our third premise is that being politically correct is not a legitimate way to think according to the opposition. Her fourth premise is that this is not a debate about free speech. And her fifth premise is that Jordan Peterson says to avoid people who use the words equity, diversity, and inclusivity. Her sixth premise is that the movie, Jordan Peterson also claims that the movie Frozen is politically correct propaganda. And her seventh premise is that Jordan Peterson proposed to make a database of university course content that doesn't include postmodern critical theory. Her eighth premise is that the political correctness debate looked very different in the 1980s. Her ninth premise is that women in education were seen as radical even when they only made up 10% of college tenure faculty. She also brings up the fact that you weren't able to call indigenous people Indians. You weren't able to use terms such as African American in the 1980s is what she's talking about. In the 1980 political correctness debate, you weren't allowed, or it was considered being politically correct to add people of color to the Western curriculum. Her 13th premise was that in the 1980s debate, it was a topic that you weren't supposed to make gay jokes anymore. Her 14th premise was that you weren't supposed to use the word retard anymore in that debate. Her 15th premise was that Miss instead of Mrs. MS versus MRS became a widely used term to address women who weren't married. She also talks about, or her 16th premise is that women with a Y instead of an E didn't stick, but it was still talked about during that debate. Her 16th premise is that she thinks that the world is moving backwards. Her 17th premise is that many places have reinstated patriarchal values to stave off chaos caused by political correctness. Her 19th premise is that the U.S. is trying to roll back social progress to overcome political correctness. And her 20th premise is, as someone who lives in the U.S., it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like we're moving backwards. And the conclusion that I believe that she makes is that political correctness can allow minorities to overcome discrimination and does represent progress. My evaluation of her argument is that I believe that Michelle has some strong points in her argument, but falls short in other places. Despite her not saying much to support her point about people using political correctness to delegitimize minorities' attempts to point out and overcome discrimination, her point that people think that simply challenging the established hierarchy is political correctness, and those same people being against the idea of political correctness supports that idea perfectly. However, when she states that the debate isn't about free speech, she never supports that statement with any facts or supporting premises or anything like that. She just simply states that and then goes into 3 completely random attacks on Jordan Peterson. Attacks being because the things that she brings up are controversial. But after this period of not supporting her statement at all, she goes back to making good arguments when she brings up the fact that political correctness was also a debate in the 80s. When she talks about how the debate in the 80s viewed things that are considered mostly normal and right today as radical, it shows that political correctness can be considered progress because those things that were considered so radical back in the 80s are now considered normal, so we've progressed to think that those things are normal. She also stresses that not all of the world is moving towards political correctness, and that the places who have moved, or which have moved backwards, are not places that she or someone who is a part of these minority groups really wants to live and thinks that it would be dangerous or scary or just not great to live there. So yeah, that's her argument and my evaluation of it.